All right, let's read some Kant. We are on to the Transcendental Dialectic, Book 2 of the Dialectical Inferences of Pure Reason. One may say that the object of a mere transcendental idea is something of which we have no concept, although the idea is produced in reason with necessity according to the original laws of reason. Nor is any concept of the understanding, that is, any concept which could be shown and rendered intuitive in a possible experience, possible for an object which should be adequate to the demands of reason. Nor is any concept of the understanding, that is, any concept which could be shown and rendered intuitive in a possible experience, possible for an object that should be adequate to demands of reason. It would be better, however, and less liable to misunderstandings, to say that we can have no knowledge of an object corresponding to an idea, but only a problematic concept of it. Okay, interesting. And I think he's kind of just pointing out kind of a skeptical view of the ability for an idea, I guess a concept rather, to adequately represent or be embodied by an object. And so we can have a really good concept of something, but that doesn't mean that there's an object that kind of fits that idea perfectly. Maybe because they're just different, They're just so different that it's not really possible. At least the transcendental subjective reality of the pure concepts of reason depends on our having been led to such ideas by a necessary syllogism. There will be syllogisms, therefore, which have no empirical premises, and by means of which we infer from something which we know something else, of which we have no concept, and to which, constrained by an inevitable illusion, we nevertheless attribute objective reality. So it will be syllogisms, and by means of which we infer from something which we know something else of which we have no concept, and then looks like the opposite maybe, and to which, constrained by an inevitable illusion, we nevertheless attribute objective reality. As regards their result, such syllogisms are to be called sophistical rather than rational. Makes sense. Although as regards their origin, they may claim the latter name, because they are not purely fictitious or accidental, but the products of the very nature of reason. They are sophistries not of human beings, but of pure reason itself. Right, there's something wrong with reason itself that causes us to do this. And even the wisest of human beings cannot escape them. All that he can do, with great effort, is guard against error. But he will never be able to rid himself completely of the illusion that constantly torments and mocks him. Of these dialectical syllogisms, there are therefore only 3 kinds. Okay, well, that's not too many. Just as many as the ideas to which their conclusions lead. In the syllogisms of the first class, I infer from the transcendental concept of the subject, which contains nothing manifold, the absolute unity of the subject itself, of which, however, I have no concept in this way. Okay. In the syllogism of the first class, I infer from the transcendental concept of the subject. So the transcendental concept of yourself, presumably, which contains nothing manifold. The absolute unity of the subject itself, even whether or not we know it's material, like the subject, ourselves, our material, or actually existing in the world, sounds like kind of a Cartesian skepticism he's starting with, of which, however, I have no concept in this way. This dialectical inference I shall call the transcendental paralogism. The second class of sophistical syllogism aims at the transcendental concept of an absolute totality in the series of conditions of any given appearance. The transcendental concept of an absolute totality in the series of conditions of any given appearance. And here I infer from the fact that my concept of the unconditioned synthetic unity of the series on one side is always self-contradictory. And here I infer from the fact that my concept of the unconditioned synthetic unity of the series on one side is always self-contradictory. The correctness of the opposite unity, of which nevertheless I have no concept either. The state of reason in these dialectical inferences I shall call the antinomy of pure reason. Lastly, according to the third class of sophistic syllogisms, beginning with the totality of conditions for thinking objects in general, insofar as they can be given to me, I infer the absolute synthetic unity of all conditions of the possibility of things in general. Okay, that is to say, from things which I do not know, according to their mere transcendental concept, I infer a being of all beings, which I know still less through a transcendental concept, and of the unconditioned necessity from which I can form no concept whatever. This dialectical syllogism I shall call the ideal of pure reason. Sounds like God or something. Okay. Transcendental Dialectic, Book 2, Chapter 1 of the Paralogisms of Pure Reason. The logical paralogism consists in the falsity of a syllogism with respect to its form. I think it's important. It's kind of a form thing, not necessarily a content issue. Be its content whatever it may. But a transcendental paralogism has a transcendental ground for inferring wrongly with respect to form. Such a fallacious inference, therefore, will have its ground in the very nature of human reason, and will produce an illusion which is inevitable, though not insoluble. It will produce an illusion that is inevitable, though not insoluble. Okay. We now come to a concept which was not inserted in our general list of transcendental concepts, and yet must be added to them, without, however, changing the table in the least, or providing it to be deficient. This is the concept, or if the term is preferred, the judgment, I think. It is easily seen, however, that this concept is the vehicle of all concepts in general, and therefore also of transcendental concepts, and that it is therefore always included among them. So kind of the self and the fact that I'm thinking something is presupposed in all concepts in general. And so is itself also transcendental. But that it has no claim to a special title, inasmuch as it serves only to introduce all thought as belonging to consciousness. However free that concept may be from all that is empirical, impressions of the senses, it serves nevertheless to distinguish two kinds of objects within the nature of our faculty of representation. I, as thinking, am an object of inner sense, and am called soul. Okay. That which is an object of the outer senses is called body. Okay. The term I, as a thinking being, means the object of psychology, which may be called the rational science of the soul, assuming that we want to know nothing about the soul except what, independently of all experience, which determines me more specifically, and, in concreto, can be inferred from the concept I, insofar as it is present in all thought. Now, the rational science of the soul is really such an undertaking. For if the smallest empirical element of my thought, or some particular perception of my inner state, were mixed up with the sources from which that science derives its knowledge, then it would be an empirical and no longer rational science of the soul. There is, therefore, an alleged science founded on the single proposition I think, the ground or absence of ground of which may well be examined here, according to the nature of a transcendental philosophy. It should not be objected that in this proposition, which expresses the perception of oneself, I have an inner experience, and that therefore the rational science of the soul, which is founded on it, can never be quite pure, but rests to a certain extent on an empirical principle. Okay. You can't really have I think he's making the distinction between inner and outer experience. And so inner experience, although experience, isn't necessarily empirical and therefore shouldn't be detrimental to this non-empirical, pure, transcendental, whatever undertaking about the rational science of the soul. But okay. For this inner perception is nothing more than mere apperception. I think, which makes even all transcendental concepts possible, because in them we really say, I think substance, I think cause, etc. This inner experience in general, and its possibility or perception in general, and its relation to other perceptions, without any particular distinction or determination of them being given empirically, cannot be regarded as empirical knowledge. It must, on the contrary, be regarded as knowledge of the empirical in general, and belongs, therefore, to the investigation of the possibility of any experience, which investigation is certainly transcendental. The smallest object of perception, for instance, even just pleasure and displeasure, if added to the general representation of self-consciousness, would at once change rational into empirical psychology. Okay? Empirical bad for this. I think is therefore the sole text of rational psychology, out of which it must develop all of its wisdom. It is easily seen that this thought, if it is to be referred to an object, myself, cannot contain any but transcendental predicates of this object. Okay, that makes sense. For the smallest empirical predicate would spoil the rational purity of the science and its independence of all experience. We shall therefore follow the guidance of the categories. Follow the guidance of the categories. To avoid them? With only this difference, that since it is a thing that is given first here, namely, I as thinking being, we must begin with the category of substance, right? By which a thing in itself is represented. and then proceed backwards, though without changing the order of the categories among one another, is given before in our table. The topic of the rational science of the soul, from which whatever else that science may contain has to be derived, is therefore the following. We have a sweet table. The soul is substance. Okay. 2. As regards to its quality, it is simple. All right. 3. As regard to the different times in which it exists, it is numerically identical, that is, unity. Okay. Not plurality. Okay. 4. It is in relation to possible objects in space. We have a footnote. The reader, who may not guess at once the psychological purport of these transcendental and abstract terms, or understand why the latter attribute of the soul belongs to the category of existence, will find a full explanation and justification in the sequel. Oh, nice. Moreover, I have to apologize for the many Latin expressions, which, contrary to good taste, have crept in instead of their native equivalents, not only here, but throughout the whole of the work. My only excuse is that I thought it better to sacrifice some elegance of language, rather than to make the student's work even harder. What a nice guy. Through the least degree of obscurity. Thank you, this is so easy. That's actually kind of nice. Okay, so there's our table, and then we continue. All concepts of pure psychology arise from these elements. Okay, soul, substance, it's simple. It's a unity, and its relation. It is in relation to possible objects in space. Okay. All concepts of pure psychology arise from these elements, simply by way of combination, and without admission of any other principle. This substance, taken merely as object of inner sense, gives us the concept of immateriality. And, as simple substance, that of incorruptibility. Okay, so concept, immateriality. But it's a substance. Okay. And as a simple substance, that of incorruptibility. Okay, that makes more sense. If it's simple, it can't be, it's indivisible, presumably. Its identity as intellectual substance gives us personality. Okay. What's he talking about? And all these three together. Spirituality. Amen. The relation of the substance to objects in space gives us commerce with bodies. I like that. And so it represents the thinking substance as the principle of life in matter, that is, as soul, anima, and as the ground of animality, and animality again, as restricted by spirituality, gives us the concept of immortality. That would be cool. Probably not that cool. After like 1,000,000 years. Or maybe a few thousand. Yeah, maybe a few hundred based on global warming. Okay. To these concepts refer 4 paralogisms. Okay, so the paralogisms, I kind of know this, but I didn't really realize that they were like one for one lining up with the chart here. So that's good to know. These concepts refer 4 paralogisms of a transcendental psychology, which is falsely supposed to be a science of pure reason concerning the nature of our thinking being. We can, however, use the foundation of such a science nothing but the simple, and by itself perfectly empty representation I, of which we cannot even say that it is a concept, but only that it is mere consciousness that accompanies all concepts. Sounds very Cartesian. Through this, I, or he, or it, the thing, which thinks, nothing is represented beyond a transcendental subject of thoughts equals X. This subject is known only through the thoughts that are its predicates. This subject is only known through the thoughts that are its predicates. Like, I think, therefore I am, and then, like, so the subject, the thinking would be the predicate, and the subject, the I, would be the subject, and that's the only way. Yeah, it kind of, I guess that lines up. And apart from them, we can never have the slightest concept of it. Therefore, we revolve around it in perpetual circle, since before we can form any judgment about it, we must already use its representation. And this convenience is really inevitable. Inconvenience, Jesus Christ. Sorry, Jesus. And this inconvenience is really inevitable, because consciousness in itself is not so much a representation, distinguishing a particular object, but really a form of representation in general, insofar as this representation is to be called knowledge. Of such representation alone can I say that I think something through it. I want to read that again. And this inconvenience is really inevitable, because consciousness in itself is not so much a representation, distinguishing a particular object, material, but really a form of representation in general. It makes sense. Insofar as this representation is to be called knowledge. Thinking, then you get to knowledge, okay, blah, blah, blah. Of such representation alone can I say I think something through it. Okay. It must, however, seem strange from the very beginning that the condition under which I think at all, and which therefore is merely a property of my own subject, should at the same time be valid for everything that thinks, and that, upon a proposition which seems to be empirical, we should venture to found an apodictic, haven't seen that word in a while, and universal judgment, namely, that everything that thinks is such as the voice of my self-consciousness declares it to be within me. Okay. The reason for this, however, is that we are... That's one thing that annoys me. The only thing that you can know thinks is yourself. So, to me, it kind of ends there. I mean, we can suspect that people think. It looks like they're thinking. They can tell us they're thinking. They can appear to have spontaneous thoughts or non-spontaneous thoughts or react to things. But we can only... Yeah, I can only personally know that I'm thinking. Anyway, I'm so smart. The reason for this, however, is that we are constrained to attribute a priori to things all the properties from which the conditions under which alone we think them. Gotta read that again. The reason for this, however, is that we are constrained. We are constrained to attribute a priori to things all properties which form the conditions under which alone we think them. Okay. So like the necessary conditions, like we a priori provide the necessary conditions under which we are able to think. Is it them? I think them is another thinking thing. I'm not sure. Now it is impossible for me to form the least representation of a thinking being through any outer experience, but can do so only through self-consciousness. That makes sense. Right, you can only think of the representation of another thinking being through your own thinking, e.g. your own self-consciousness. Such objects, therefore, are nothing but a transference of my own consciousness to other things, which thus alone can be represented as thinking beings. So I transfer what I think my ability to think is, consciousness, etc., to other presumed thinking beings for that representation. The proposition I think, however, is used in this process only problematically. Okay. It is not used insofar as it may contain the perception of an existence. Sorry, it's only used problematically, the I think. It is not used insofar as it may contain the perception of an existence. But with regard, the Cartesian cogito, oh man, what an idiot. The Cartesian cogito ergo sum, but with regard to its mere possibility, it is used in order to see what properties may flow from such a simple proposition to its subject, whether such a subject exists or not. If our knowledge of thinking beings in general, insofar as it comes from pure reason, are founded on more than the cogito, the thinking, and if we made use at the same time of our observations as regards the play of our thoughts and the natural laws of the thinking self to be drawn from them, then we should have before us an empirical psychology that would form a kind of physiology of inner sense. Okay. And it would perhaps explain the appearances of inner sense, but would never help us to reveal such properties as do not belong at all to possible experience, as for instance the properties of the simple, or to teach us apodictically anything touching on the nature of thinking beings in general. I agree. It would not therefore be a rational psychology. Okay, I think that's important. I'm going to reread that paragraph, even though I think I kind of got it. If our knowledge of thinking beings in general, insofar as it comes from pure reason, were founded on more than the cogito, and if we made use at the same time of our observations as regards the play of our thoughts and the natural laws of the thinking self to be drawn from them, then we should have before us an empirical psychology that would form a kind of physiology of inner sense. Right. In other words, if we were kind of able to figure out that other beings or thinking beings, or like put ourselves, I don't know, posit the existence and thinkingness of other beings, then that would be kind of like the way we physically posit other beings, like physiologically. This is the kind of the term he uses. So that makes sense. But we can't do that. It'd be crazy. And it would perhaps explain the appearances of inner sense, but would never help us to reveal such properties as do not belong at all to possible experience, as for instance, the properties of the simple, or to teach us apodictically anything touching on the nature of thinking beings in general. It would not therefore be a rational psychology. Okay. I feel like I got that better the first time. All right, so this is... I'm on page 321. This is where the A edition and the B edition split off. And the A edition is much longer, and I'm going to read that first, obviously. I don't know how far I'm going to go into it, but yeah. As the proposition I think, taken problematically, contains the form of any judgment of the understanding in general, and accompanies all categories as their vehicle, okay, it must be clear that the inferences from it can only contain a transcendental use of the understanding. As a proposition I think, taken problematically, contains the form of any judgment of the understanding in general, right, like you said, every posit is an implied I think. Everything you posit, or every idea or concept or understanding, reason, whatever, and accompanies all categories as their vehicle, meaning the way we communicate ideas is through the I think, it must be clear that the inferences from it can only contain a transcendental use of the understanding. I kind of get what he's saying. I don't know if I could explain it though. Like, because the I think is just using reason and judgment, etc. Even though it could be using experience, it is still just positing like judgments. It is still like confined to those things. It can't then posit like a physical thing or something. So in a way, the only way that we can use those things are transcendentally, I think, is kind of the thing. I don't know. And he's saying taken problematically, so maybe this is, not good, or like not ideal, or, not the actual way things work. Maybe it's like a bastardized way of, but whatever. Okay. Such use excludes all admixture of experience, and hence excludes all admixture. Okay, so it excludes experience, and hence, after what has been shown above with respect to its achievements, we cannot entertain any favorable anticipations. We shall therefore follow it with a critical eye through all the predicaments of pure psychology. All right, the first paralogism of substantiality, that the representation of which is the absolute subject of our judgments, and cannot be used, therefore, as determination of another thing, is substance. What? The representation of which is the absolute subject of our judgments, and cannot be used, therefore, as determination of another thing, is substance. Wow, that's a weird way to say that. That the representation of which is the absolute subject of our judgments, and cannot be used, therefore, as determination of another thing, is substance. So effectively, you cannot use substance to make judgments or determinations about maybe another substance, but probably more likely a non-substantive, well, substantive is a bad word, non-physical, non-similar thing. Is that kind of what he's saying? So I can't look at a substance, figure out something about it, and then, gosh, I don't know. I, as a thinking being, am the absolute subject of all my possible judgments, and this representation of myself cannot be used as a predicate of any other thing. Therefore, I, as thinking being, am substance. Oh man, that sounds like a fucking syllogism. God damn it. Okay. That the representation, I kind of wish feels like a translation issue. Not that it's a bad translation, but just like, feels like in German this would be maybe make more sense. Because like the way that these sentences are structured is just so odd. That the representation of which is the absolute subject of our judgments, and cannot be used, therefore, as determination of another thing, is substance. I, as a thinking being, am the absolute subject of all my possible judgments. That makes sense. And this representation of myself cannot be used as predicate of any other thing. That part makes sense to me. Therefore, I, as thinking being, soul, am substance. Okay, let's see what he has to say about that. Criticism of the first paralogism of pure psychology. We have shown in the analytical part of the transcendental logic that pure categories, and among them that of substance, have in themselves no objective meaning, unless they rest on an intuition to the manifold of which they can be applied as functions of synthetic unity. Okay, yeah? The categories, until they actually apply to something, are kind of not super helpful, don't really have much meaning. They have to be animated by, okay. Without this, they are merely functions of a judgment and are without content. I can say of everything in general that it is substance. I can say of everything in general that it is substance, insofar as I distinguish it from what are mere predicates and determinations of things. Okay, so we're defining substance in the negative here as a non-predicate or determination. Now in all our thought, the I is the subject, in which thoughts are inherent only as determinations. And this I cannot be used as the determination of any other thing. That kind of makes sense to me. Okay. Thus, everybody is constrained to look upon himself as the substance. And upon thought as only the accidents of his being and determinations of his state. But what use are we to make of such a concept of a substance? That I, as a thinking being, continue by myself, and do not naturally either arise or perish, is no legitimate inference from it. And yet this inference would be the only advantage that could be gained from the concept of the substantiality of myself as thinking subject, and apart from this, I could do very well without it. Okay, they making the point that I, as like a merely thinking subject, it doesn't posit any necessary physicality, and therefore it would be possible that I was never born or will never die, since death is physical, partially at least. But that doesn't make a lot of sense. That's what he kind of implies here. That would be an advantage. Okay. So far from being able to infer these properties from the pure category of a substance, we must, on the contrary, lay at the foundation the permanence of an object given in our experience if we wish to apply to it the empirically usable concept of a substance. Okay. In the above proposition, however, we have not laid any experience at the foundation, but have merely formed an inference from the concept which all thought has to the I, as the common subject in which it inheres. Nor should we, whatever we did, succeed by any sure observation in establishing such permanence. For although the I exists in all thoughts, not the slightest intuition is connected with this representation by which it would be distinguished from other objects of intuition. Okay. We may very well perceive, therefore, that this representation occurs again and again in all thought, but not that it is a constant and enduring intuition in which all thoughts as changeable come and go. Hence it follows that the first syllogism of transcendental psychology imposes upon us a merely supposed new insight by representing the constant logical subject of thought as the knowledge of the real subject in which thought inheres, representing the constant logical subject of thought as the knowledge of the real subject in which the thought inheres. So what he's saying is like, just the idea that, you know, our thoughts occur over time implies a constant logical subject. Because something has to be thinking it, like whatever, like, as the knowledge of a real, but that doesn't mean that there's a real subject which is constant over that time, necessarily. Okay. Of this subject, however, we have not and cannot have the least knowledge, because consciousness is that which alone changes all representations into thoughts, and hence solely in it, as the subject, must all our representations be found, or all our perceptions be found. Beside this logical meaning of the I, we have no knowledge of the subject in itself, which forms the substratum and foundation of it, and of all our thoughts. Okay, I think I kind of get what he's saying. And, like, the point is, like, we are thinking beings, and that's kind of how that's kind of our inner sense, and in a certain way, the consistency of logical thought over a period of time implies that we know something, that the substance is also consistent, but that doesn't necessarily have to be true. We don't necessarily know that. All that we know is, well, I don't want to say that all that we know, but like knowing about the current, past, and past presence of thoughts doesn't necessarily posit a physicality and a body with it. It just means that there's been a logic of thoughts over that time consistently. It doesn't mean that there's some physical component that's also been consistent with it. In other words, the fact that I can think of thoughts from a long time ago doesn't mean that I myself am the same person from that time at which I posit that thought. It's kind of a, you know, we are using an intellectual consistency and translating it into a physical consistency, which is not. And I think like the larger point that he was kind of making earlier is that between the physical and the mental, like the thoughts are all mental, and they just really, they don't necessarily connect to the physical. And this is kind of funneling it through the idea of the self. And so we have all these thoughts and, you know, kind of a sense of personhood, I guess, in a way, which is the combination of thoughts and physicality. But there isn't necessarily that connection. We just assume that that's true. Okay. In spite of this, the proposition the soul is substance may well be allowed to stand. Provided, well, that would be weird. That would be a little weird, I guess, because I don't know, it depends on what you mean by the soul, but like I suppose that's probably different than brain that provides thoughts, but like as like the animating feature, the soul being the animating feature of the body, you would think that would be pretty similar to the thinking feature of the body, in that it's a non-physical thing that doesn't necessarily correspond to our body. So that's kind of weird. Let's see what he says. In spite of this, the proposition the soul is substance may well be allowed to stand, provided that we see that this concept cannot help us in the least or teach us any of the ordinary conclusions of the sophistical science of the soul, as for instance the everlasting duration of the soul in all alterations, and even in death, and that this concept therefore signifies substance only in idea, not in reality. Kind of lost me there. Soul as substance may well be allowed to stand, provided that we see that this concept cannot help us on in the least or teach us any of the ordinary conclusions of the sophistical science of the soul, as for instance the everlasting duration of the soul in all alterations and even in death. Okay, so it may be allowed to stand, but it doesn't necessarily have to be true. It could be true. Okay. All right, the second paralogism of simplicity. That thing, the action of which can never be considered as the concurrence of several acting things is simple. That thing, the action of which can never be considered as the concurrence of several acting things, is simple. So it's just one acting thing. Can never be more than one. That's simple. Now the soul, or the thinking I, is such a thing. It's a single thing, single thinking thing. Therefore, it says etc., but I think it means that to say, therefore, the soul is simple. But it doesn't actually say it, just says etc. Alright, soul is simple? Question mark? Okay. Future me will definitely look into that. Not really. Criticism of the second paralogism of transcendental psychology. This is the Achilles of all dialectical inferences of pure psychology. The Achilles of all dialectical inferences of pure psychology. The soul is simple. Okay. It is not a mere sophistical game contrived by a dogmatist in order to impart a certain plausibility to his assertions, but an inference which seems to be able to stand the sharpest examination and the gravest doubts of the philosopher. It is this: every composite substance is an aggregate of many substances, and the action of something composite, or that which is inherent in it, as thus composite, is an aggregate of many actions or accidents distributed among the many substances. An effect, due to the concurrence of many acting substances, is no doubt possible if that effect is merely external, as for instance the motion of a body is the combined motion of all its parts. The case is different, however, with thoughts, if considered as accidents belonging internally to a thinking being. For suppose it to be the composite that thinks. Then every part of it would contain a part of the thought, and only all of them together would contain the whole thought. Interesting. So I'm underlining that in addition to highlighting it. This, however, is contradictory. For as the representations distributed among different beings, for instance the single words of a verse, never make a whole thought. So for as the representations distributed among different beings, the single words of a verse, never make a whole thought a verse. A verse, I should say. It is impossible that a thought should adhere in something composite as such. Thought, therefore, is possible only in one substance, which is not an aggregate of many, and is therefore absolutely simple. I think what he's saying is like, okay, so you have a verse of like 20 words. You don't get the definition of each of those words individually to understand what that verse is about. You kind of holistically come to it by reading the whole thing together, in a way. Because it's relational and, I don't know, hermeneutic. That's a big word. It would be very easy to dress this proof up in the usual academic garb, but for my purposes it's sufficient to have clearly... Okay. What is called... And then he goes into it. Nervus probandi. What is called the nervus probandi in this argument? Sorry, I gotta look at that. Footnote 28. Nervus probandi. Oh, the footnote system in this book is just absolutely horrible. What page are we on? 320 something. What was it? 28? Nervus probandi, the nerve of the proof. Weird. Okay. What is called the nervus probandi, the nerve of the proof, in this argument lies in the proposition that in order for many representations to constitute one thought, they must be contained in the absolute unity of the thinking subject. That's right. We learned that in the transcendental thing earlier. What was it called? You know, the unity of apperception, all that other junk. Logic, I don't know. Nobody, however, can prove this proposition from concepts. Yeah, interesting. So is it empirical? For how would he undertake to do it? The proposition, a thought, can only be the effect of the absolute unity of the thinking being, cannot be considered as analytic. That's for sure. For the unity of thought consisting of many representations is collective and can, as far as mere concepts are concerned, refer to the collective unity of all cooperating substances, as the motion of a body is the composite motion of all its parts, just as well as it can refer to the absolute unity of the subject. Okay? According to the rule of identity, it would be impossible, therefore, to establish the necessity of presupposing for a composite thought a simple substance. That, on the contrary, such a proposition might be known synthetically and entirely a priori from mere concepts is something that no one will venture to affirm who has understood the grounds of the possibility of synthetic a priori propositions as explained by us above. I don't think I did much there, but... So it's not synthetic a priori either. It is based on experience. It is likewise impossible, however, to derive this necessary unity of the subject as the condition of the possibility of every thought from experience. Ooh, I was wrong about that too. So what is it, Kant? It's just impossible? For experience never yields any knowledge of necessity. All right. Much less the concept of absolute unity, which is far beyond its realm. Right? Just because we experience something one way doesn't mean it has to be true. Learn that in page 4. Okay. Whence then do we take this proposition on which the whole psychological syllogism rests? I do not know. It is manifest that if we wish to represent to ourselves a thinking being, then we must put ourselves in its place, and substitute, as it were, the object which has to be considered by our own subject, which never happens in any other kind of investigation. Okay, so we have to put ourselves in the shoes of the thinking being. Okay. The reason why we require absolute unity of the subject for every thought is that otherwise we could not say, I think. The reason why we require absolute unity of the subject for every thought is that otherwise we cannot say I think. The manifold in one representation. Interesting. Okay. And meaning, like, you know, he's kind of established that I think is kind of the logical form or undercurrent of kind of every concept, thought, you know, whatever, proposition. And if it weren't true that the ideas are singular in me, then I wouldn't be able to say that. I would be saying things like, I don't know. I wouldn't be saying I think, right? It would be some sort of composite of a bunch of different things that we're thinking. I don't know if I buy that. That kind of seems like word games more than actual truth. Logically, it makes sense based on, like, the definitions of I think. Like, it has to, like, I think something presupposes a singular being thinking, and the ideas coming from a singular place, I suppose. But I don't know. It seems kind of cheeky to be honest with you. The manifold in one representation. Although it does fit in pretty nicely with, like, the unity of apperception and all that stuff from the really hard section that I'm gonna look it up. What the hell is that section called? Is it the transcendental logic? No, it's not the logic. It's the analytic, right? Yeah, that's it. The transcendental analytic. Yeah. Oh, man. For although the whole of a thought may be divided and distributed among many subjects, yet the subjective I cannot be thus distributed. And it is this I which presupposes in all thought. Okay? I'm with you, Kant. I'm generally there. Just as in the former paralogism, therefore, so here too, the formal proposition of apperception, I think, remains the sole ground for which rational psychology ventures upon the extension of its knowledge. This proposition, however, is not an experience, but only the form of apperception. Gotta highlight that, sorry. This proposition, however, is not an experience, but only the form of apperception that adheres and is antecedent to every experience. The I think is the form, okay, but it must always be taken only as referring to a possible knowledge in general, namely as a merely subjective condition of that knowledge. We have no right to turn it into a condition of the possibility of the knowledge of objects, that is, into a concept of a thinking being in general. Okay, that makes sense. But we do so because we cannot represent such a being to ourselves, save by putting ourselves with the formula of our consciousness in the place of any other intelligent being. Oh man, this is a lot longer than the first one. Okay. Sorry, I'm going to reread that paragraph. Just as in the former paralogism, therefore, So here too, the formal proposition of apperception, I think, remains the sole ground on which rational psychology ventures upon the extension of its knowledge. Okay. This proposition, however, is not an experience, but only the form of apperception that adheres and is antecedent to every experience. Okay, so it's not an experience, but rather the form. Okay. But it must always be taken only as referring to a possible knowledge in general, namely, as a merely subjective condition of that knowledge. Right, so all I can really, and this maybe was the point I was making earlier that I thought was kind of original. You can only really say this about yourself. This is like the subjective condition of your knowledge. That it comes within the unity of you, and that's how you're able to say the I think. But you can't necessarily impute that to other people, or people generally, because we don't know that. I don't know. I don't really understand that necessarily. We have no right to turn it into a condition of the possibility of knowledge of objects. Oh, that is into a concept of a thinking being in general. But we do so. All right, so I think what he's saying is like we can kind of do this and put it in the individual, like put this subjective condition in the individual as the form, meaning the way in which they actually experience things, and those things are simple and unified within a single being. But that doesn't mean that it is a condition of the possibility of the knowledge of objects. Like necessarily. That doesn't mean it is how objects are known. And we can't make a concept about that related to thinking beings in general. Okay. But we do so because we cannot represent such a being to ourselves, save by putting ourselves with the formula of our consciousness in the place of any other intelligent being. Okay. Nor is it true that simplicity of myself as soul is really inferred from the proposition, I think, for that simplicity is already involved in every thought itself. The proposition I am simple must be considered as an immediate expression of apperception, in what is known as the Cartesian inference, cogito ergo sum, is in reality tautological, because cogito sum cogitans predicates my reality immediately. Just thinking predicates my reality. I think, therefore I am. The I think is sufficient there for Kant. Okay. I am simple means no more than this representation. I does not contain the smallest manifoldness, and that it is absolute, although merely logical, unity. Thus we see that the famous psychological proof is founded merely on the invisible unity of representation, which governs only the verb think with respect to a person. But it is clear that the subject of inherence is designated only transcendentally by the I, which adheres to the thought, without our noticing the smallest property of it. In fact, without our knowing anything about it. So the thinking is the important part. The I, we don't really know. The I is just kind of presupposed. Okay. It signifies a something in general, transcendental subject, the representation of which must no doubt be simple. Because in this something, we determine nothing whatsoever, and nothing can be represented more simply than through the concept of a mere something. The simplicity of the representation of a subject, however, is not therefore a knowledge of the simplicity of the subject itself, because we abstract altogether from its properties when we designate it solely by the empty expression I, which we can apply to every thinking subject. Okay. So much, then, is certain, that through the I always think in absolute but logical unity of the subject, simplicity, but not that I thereby know the actual simplicity of my subject. Okay. We saw that the proposition I am substance signifies nothing but the mere category of which I must not make any use, empirically, in concreto. In the same manner, I may legitimately say, I am simple substance, that is, a substance the representation of which contains no synthesis of the manifold. But this concept, and also this proposition, teaches us nothing at all with respect to myself as an object of experience. For the concept of substance itself is used only as a function of synthesis, without any intuition for it to rest on. Okay. And therefore without any object, like without the I, the substance, okay. And therefore without any object, and is valid only of the condition of our knowledge, but not of any object that can be specified. We shall test the usefulness of this proposition by an experiment. Everybody must admit that the assertion of the simple nature of the soul can only be of any value insofar as it enables me to distinguish the subject from all matter, and thus to exempt it from that decay to which matter is at all times subject. Okay, right, because if it's simple, it's indivisible and like indestructible effectively, can't be broken down in any way, and therefore it must be eternal. Kant is a Christian, I believe, so it is for that use that our above proposition is really intended, and it is therefore often expressed thus: the soul is not corporeal. Let us assume that I can show that even if we allow this cardinal proposition of rational psychology in the pure meaning of a mere judgment of reason, derived from pure categories, all objective validity, everything that thinks is simple substance. Okay. We still cannot make the least use of this proposition in order to establish whether the soul is heterogeneous from or related to matter. If I can show this, then this will be the same as if I had relegated this supposed psychological insight to the field of mere ideas, which lack the reality of objective use. We have irrefutably proved in the transcendental aesthetic that bodies are mere appearances of our outer sense, not things in themselves. We are justified, therefore, in saying that our thinking subject is not corporeal, i.e., that since it is represented by us as an object of inner sense, it cannot, insofar as it thinks, be an object of our outer senses, that is, an appearance in space. Okay. On highlighter number 3 now. This means the same as that among outer appearances. Among outer appearances, we can never find thinking beings in general, or ever outwardly intuit their thoughts, their consciousness, their desires, etc., for all this belongs to inner sense. Okay. This argument seems indeed so natural and popular that even the commonest understanding has always been led to it, and it has long since supported the notion and it has long since are completely distinct beings from bodies. All right, meaning like the soul is like a thought of the body. You can't perceive it. You can't. Yeah. Okay. But although extension, impenetrability, cohesion, and motion, in short, everything that the outer senses can give us, can neither be nor contain thoughts, feeling, inclination, or resolution, these never being objects of outer intuition. Nevertheless, something which forms the foundation of outer appearances and which affects our sense in such a way that it obtains the representations of space, matter, shape, etc., might yet, if considered as noumenon, nonsensible, a nonsensible thing, or better, as a transcendental object, be at the same time also the subject of our thoughts, although by the manner in which it affects our outer sense, we obtain no intuition of representations, will, etc., but only of space and its determinations. This something, however, is not extended, not impenetrable, not composite, because such predicates concern only sensibility and its intuition, insofar as we are affected by these, to us otherwise unknown, objects. Okay, these expressions, however, do not give us any information, I agree, as to what kind of object it is, but only that to this object, if considered in itself, if considered in itself, and so without reference to the outer senses, these predicates of outer appearance cannot be ascribed. These predicates of inner sense alone, representations and thought, do not contradict this object. Accordingly, even if we admit the simplicity of its nature, the human soul is thereby not at all sufficiently distinguished from matter, as far as the substratum of matter is concerned, if matter is considered, as it ought to be, merely an appearance. Okay. So if matter is merely an appearance, it's just our experience of the world, and our perception of it, there's no reason that we can't, suppose some animating soul aspect of it. Whereas if we knew the thing in itself, we might know some reason, I suppose, why it couldn't have a soul, or could, or the soul was physical, or something else. But we can't really know that, as we can't know a thing in itself. If matter were a thing in itself, it would, as a composite being, be totally different from the soul, as a simple being. Because it is material, right? The soul's not material, and the body is material. In that situation, if we were to able to know it in and of in itself, but since we don't know it in itself, everything is kind of up for grabs. Okay. But what we call matter is only outer appearance, the substratum of which cannot be known through any predicates that we assign to it. I can therefore very well suppose that this substratum in itself is simple, although by the manner in which it affects our senses, it produces in us the intuition of something extended and therefore composite. Okay. I may further suppose, therefore, that the substance, which, with respect to our outer sense, possesses extension, might very well be in itself cohabitated by thoughts, which can be represented consciously by its own inner sense. Right? In such a way, the same thing, which in one respect is called corporeal, would in another respect at the same time be a thinking being. And although we could not intuit its thoughts, yet we could see the signs of them in appearance. Thus the expression that only souls, as a particular kind of substances, think would have to be dropped. And we should return to the common expression that human beings think. That is, that the same thing which, as an outer appearance, is extended, is internally in itself a subject, and is not composite, but is simple and thinks. But without indulging in such hypotheses, we can make this general remark, that if I understand by a soul a thinking being in itself, then the very question as to whether or not the soul be the same kind as matter, be the same in kind as matter, which is not a thing in itself, but only a kind of representation in us, would be absurd. Hold on, what? But without indulging in such hypotheses, we can make this general remark, that if I understand by soul a thinking being in itself, then the very question as to whether or not the soul be the same in kind as matter would be absurd. Because in that situation, the soul would be a thinking being in itself, and then matter would not be a thinking being in itself. For so much at all events must be clear, that a thing in itself is of a different nature from the determinations which constitute merely its state. Okay. If, on the contrary, we compare the thinking I, not with matter, but with the intelligible, that forms the foundations of outer appearances, which we call matter, then it follows, since we know nothing whatever of the intelligible, that we have no right to say that the soul is in any respect internally different from it. The simple consciousness is not, therefore, a knowledge of the simple nature of our subject, so that we might thereby distinguish it from matter as a composite being. Okay. If, therefore, in the only case where that concept might be useful, namely in comparing myself with objects of outer experience, it is not sufficient for determining the particular and distinguishing characteristics of its nature. If, therefore, in the only case where that concept might be useful, namely, in comparing myself with objects of outer experience, it is not sufficient for determining the particular and distinguishing characteristics of its nature. Then, although we may still pretend to know that the thinking I, or the soul, a name for the transcendental object of inner sense, is simple, such a way of speaking admits of no application to real objects, and so cannot expand our knowledge in the least. What? If, therefore, in the only case where that concept might be useful, namely, in comparing myself with objects of outer experience, it is not sufficient for determining the peculiar and distinguishing characteristics of its nature, which it isn't, we may still pretend to know that the thinking I, or the soul, is simple. Such a way of speaking admits of no application to real objects, and so cannot expand our knowledge in the least. Thus collapses the whole of rational psychology along with its fundamental support. And neither here nor elsewhere can we hope through mere concepts, still less through the mere subjective form of all our concepts, that is, through our consciousness, and without referring to these concepts to possible experience, to expand our knowledge. This is so particularly because even the fundamental concept of a simple nature is such that it can never be met with in any experience, so that no chance remains of arriving at it as objectively valid concept. Whew. Okay. Oh man. I'm gonna stop now. Hour 20. That's pretty much my max. How long is the third paralogism? That's not that long. And the fourth. And I wanna watch a video or two, and maybe read some of the support materials, just explaining each of the paralogisms again. I felt like I got the first one pretty okay. The second one, I felt like I understood it at first, and then it just went off the rails there at the end. But yeah, those are the first two paralogisms. Crazy.